Hello and welcome to my channel. If you've ever watched a video on how to build a quadcopter, you've probably come across this build. This is the UAV Futures $99 budget build. This is the first quadcopter I've ever built, and I gotta say I've had an absolute blast with it. I've definitely got my money's worth, but I kind of outgrew it, so I've planned a new build. I'm going to be sticking with the same frame because I really like it. So let me show you the parts that I've got planned for this new build. This is the frame. It's the LS210. It's only $15. It's about 97 grams. It's about 4 millimeters thick, but it's pretty cheap, so I mean, if you break it, you can just get a new frame for $15. Some frames that have replaceable arms, just the arms, cost $15, so I think it's a great option, and it's really light, and I like it. So here's the rest of the parts I'm going to be using. I've got the Betaflight F3 flight controller. Mine does have some issues with it. The pads aren't completely covered. I'll try and pop in a close-up of that. But it does serve as a PDB and flight controller. Battery leads come, they sandwich top and bottom right on there. It is a little tricky to wire this, so it does probably need to be done in a certain order. You gotta do the bottom and then the top. This is the bottom here. So that's the flight controller I'm going to be using. For the ESCs, I have got the DYS 35 amp BL Heli 32-bit ESCs. I've never used them before, but this flight controller is intended for individual ESCs. There is a way to use a 4-in-1 ESC with this flight controller, but you gotta cross over here with some solder, but I'm not going to be doing that. I'm just going to be trying out these ESCs because I've never used them before. And let me show you the motors. These are the RCX 2206 2400 kV. They're the V3s, the latest version. Every once in a while they'll update something small here or there, so this is the latest version of them. Joshua Bardwell seems to rave about these things, and I picked up a pair. I want to try them out. They're supposed to have about 1.7 grams of thrust, 1.7 kilograms of thrust each. So it should be pretty strong, and I hope it's a good match with the ESCs. So that's what I've got. I've got this 1000 TV line CCD camera, really cheap, about 10 bucks, but I have a bunch of them. They work really great, so I'm going to be sticking with it. It fits perfectly with this frame. So with the flight controller, it doesn't come with an XT60, so you're going to need a battery lead with it. For my VTX, I'm just going to be using the Eachine Tx801. It's what I had laying around. It's kind of a weird VTX. It's got a microphone on it, but there is no wire for the audio. I imagine that these pads down here, you can probably direct solder to them, but I have yet to find a diagram for what these pads are. If anybody out there has a diagram for these pads, let me know in the comments below. So that's what I have laying around. That's what I'm going to be using. This is going to be for my receiver. I just put on some silicone wire at the end because these are just plastic wires that it comes with, and I hate using them, so I'm going to be using some silicone onto the board there. This is the antenna, just a little Amway antenna for my VTX. I always put a beeper on my builds, and lately I've been putting a capacitor on my builds after I already finish. So this time I'm going to be planning on putting it from the beginning, because it's usually an afterthought, so I'm going to go with it just from the beginning and maybe plan it out where it's going to sit, where it's not in the way. And there's a few other things you're going to need. You're probably going to need a pair of props. You'll need a battery strap, and you're going to need some tools. I'll be using some heat shrink, I'm sure, wire cutters, some tweezers, screwdriver, might need a blade, and this is my absolute favorite tool. This is just a pair of Kelly clamps. It's really great for getting in there, holding a wire with one hand while you got the solder iron in the other hand. So I use these absolutely every build, and it's my favorite tool. So that's everything I should need. If I come across anything else, I'll let you know as we go. So let's get started. Okay, here's the very first thing I'm going to do. I'm starting with the underside of this board, and there are these tiny pads right here. I'm going to bridge these first two pads, and that's going to give the full battery voltage to this pad right here. My VTX can handle up to 24 volts, so I'm going to put the VBAT onto this pad. If you wanted that pad to be 5 volts, you would do solder together and bridge the left two pads, and that would give 5 volts to this pad over here. So the first thing I'm going to do is just go ahead and bridge those two pads, and the camera and VTX ground are going to be going to this pad right here. This is going to be for my VTX power. The video out is going to be the VTX video line, and video in is going to be the video from the camera, and I'm going to power my camera from one of these 5 volt pads here. So I mounted the board on the frame with some short screws just so I can get an idea for how everything's going to fit. I've got my VTX on the back. This is the underside of the board, the bottom. My camera will be in the front, and I've sort of cut the wires where they need to be, except for the VTX power wires. They're going to be coming to about here, so I'm just going to go ahead and cut those now. And the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to be trying to bridge these tiny pads here to get the full battery voltage into this pad over here. So I've got a tiny drop of solder on there. I bridged the two pads over. Now I should have the full battery voltage going to the RAN pin over here. So I'm going to start wiring up my camera and VTX. So this is what the VTX and camera wiring setup looks like. I've got them coming into the top, video in from the camera, video out, the video from the VTX power. I've got the VBAT running to this power, and I have the camera and VTX grounded on the same pad because that is important for a good signal. I did get a drop of solder right on a 5 volt pad, and rather than take it off, I just used it to power my camera. So that is actually UART 2, and there are a couple more UARTs on the top of the board, and I'd rather do my receiver on the top of the board anyways. So here we have UART number 3, ground 5 volt RX TX, and this is UART 1. TX, RX, 5 volt, and ground. And I could use either one of those, so probably just going to use UART number 1 and just get my receiver soldered in right now. Okay, and here's my receiver. I just added silicone wires so it's easier. Signal will be going to RX. In this case, this is UART 1, so I have it going to RX1. Receiver is ground, 5 volt, and RX1. It's going to be on UART 1. I'm using S-Bus, so I'm just going to go into Betaflight afterwards and make sure I have S-Bus selected and put my receiver onto UART 1. Next, I'm going to add my buzzer. So the buzzer is on. Next, the battery leads. Okay, I just finished all the soldering. I got all the ESCs wired up. Double checking all of my wiring to make sure that there were no mistakes before I powered up. And I found a huge problem. I wired the battery leads backwards. That is probably the worst mistake that you can make. So I'm going to have to desolder these, flip them, and solder them back on. So I'm going to go back and edit the video just to make sure that if anybody following along doesn't make this same mistake, but always check for polarity. I was too caught up in the bottom and top of this board, and I soldered it on backwards. So I'm going to go fix that right now, and I'll be right back. Let's get these ESCs opened up. Let's see what it comes with. It comes with a ESC protector. That's pretty nice. Has the wires already soldered on, and extra heat shrink. Okay, I just unboxed all the ESCs, and I took them and I flipped them upside down. I have the board also upside down, so this is the bottom, and I'm going to measure and cut all of the wires so that I have them the right length. Then I'm going to solder all of the power wires for the ESCs, which is on the underside of the board. Then I'm going to take the whole thing and flip it over right side up and solder the signal and ground, which are on the top side of the board. This frame is symmetrical, so once I have the bottom soldered, if I flip everything over, it should fit perfectly exactly where I have it lined up back on the frame. So I'm going to measure and cut and then start soldering. So I've taken the board. I have all of my ESCs in the same exact spot. It's just going to be easier to solder like this. I've tinned the ESC wires, and I'm getting ready to tin the pads on the flight control. Okay, I've finished wiring the ESCs onto the bottom of the board, and I'm going to now flip it over, and I'm going to measure, cut, and solder all of the signal and ground wires that go onto the top of the board. I'm going to start by tinning all the pads and start with the soldering. Now I am soldering the signal and ground for the ESCs. So this is why I love this tool. Get right into wherever you need to go. Here's what it looks like all wired up. ESCs wired on the top and the bottom. Battery lead, that's my receiver wire. We've got the beeper on the underside. I have the camera, VTX, receivers on top, ESCs are wired onto the bottom. We still need to put the SD card in there, so I think it's ready to mount on the frame. Let's see how it looks. Okay, now it's starting to look like something. I mounted the flight controller. I have the ESCs taped down pretty much where I want them. I mounted all the motors. And the next step is to cut the motor wires, solder onto the ESC, and we should be done with the soldering. So let me start tinning the pads, cutting the wires, and we'll see how it looks. All the soldering is finished. One of my receiver wires looks like it broke. I'm gonna plug in a LiPo, and let's cross our fingers, hope everything powers up. Alright, looks good, sounds good, no smoke.